To get them to the front. I see. Okay. I didn't remind anybody about this, I'm sure. That's why we have this kind of attendance. That's good. TZ, let's sit down. Now I have to remind everybody that, hey, crowd, come. Oh, you think I've lost power? Danny? Once you are here, everybody is here. You see that your power cloud.
Yeah, I put my power in here. And this doesn't
Good. Yeah, no, I can just talk. Yes. Danny, you used to remind everybody. I forgot it.
Then I lost my power.
Yeah. Chililo, are you ready? You got my email?
When did you send?
In the morning.
I've been in my station.
Yes.
I checked all the emails.
Man. You have to listen carefully to what's being said. I sent an email that said that. You have to listen carefully.
My power is to come.
I can see that.
Power.
I can see that there.
I'm in the auditorium. I'm in the auditorium.
Chililo, if you are going to discuss and What? You're right. Yeah, you're right.
Lazy. Let's do it. Say that again.
You're going to get started. For 5 minutes. We have to listen carefully. That is being said. TZ, are we ready?
I'm ready.
Is Steve here? He's not here. He has to listen to you. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce, to present to yourself Professor Tufuku Zuberi from the University of Pennsylvania, otherwise called TZ. He's been a pen, and he used to be called Auditorium McDaniels. When I first exchanged emails in 1996, they were coming from Professor Auditorium McDaniels. We have worked together with him for a long time, and we continue to work together. He is a demographer of renown, not only a demographer, but a highly politically conscious professional who blends demography with the post-liberation politics of Africa, deals with the issues of the African diaspora, what the future might portend. More importantly, he is facilitated and trained, being a demographer at Pennsylvania University. I can mention names across the continent. Names Zimbabwe, Banda, Matthew, Cameroon, Malawi, Zulu, Eze, Nigeria, Yangon, in Senegal, come to Kenya. I mean, it's quite a number, Opio in Kenya, and many, many others. And one without fear of contradiction. He has entrenched the demography discipline in Africa and in its kind of modern form, but also looking at what historically the issues are. We established with him African Census Analysis Project, ACAP, which has been a preeminent faculty that saw to the revival of census records that were irretrievable and now can be used by African countries. Well, he has arrows on his back. And, some of the challenges that we have had in recent times was that that project has been, we lost a lot in trying to advance that project. We lost a lot of traction because of the balance of forces globally and the fight over ideas and intellect. We haven't given up. He'll be a keynote address. He'll deliver a keynote address at the IUSSP on Sunday. I thought that we here at SSA have to listen to him. In 1998, that's when we established ACAP, and we have been through a number of sessions as well as publications of books, including the demography, after Rholihlahla, the demography of South Africa. TZ is a brother, a friend, an African, a scholar, somebody who wants to participate and actively those who are in the liberation of Africa. TZ, I present you to this audience. I should have reminded them because this lecture series has come to a stop, but I present you to this audience. I have three people who will be discussants, but I realize that Chief is not here, but he knows TZ and I'm sure he will be able to know something. But the discussants will talk for 5 minutes because these matters are about the youth and the future. And here we have people who are young, who are talking about the future, particularly this demographic dividend that I've been talking about. To be Rholihlahla, who is the president of the Ghana African Statisticians, and we talked about that with the minister in the morning when he was here, Trevor Manuel, and he asked, where is the YAS? And I said, well, it's weak on the knees. And the past president, Akon will talk about it. More importantly, I think it's the fact that Akon has written in ways that TZ has written in looking at in their master's research with the Grand Hill University in that covers some of the subjects. And I think there's a lot of intersection of what, and then Rholihlahla will give, but he's not here now, that's the problem. But I think he will give perspective, deeper perspective as to how, as he takes over the organization, we will continue to lead this discourse. I know I've taken too long, but I wanted to give this context. TZ, over to you.
You can hear me? No. I think this is not working.
I can give you this one, but it has feedback. That's the problem.
Okay.
Is it go?
Well, it seems it seems to be.
Hello.
Yeah.
I think you said this one. Hello. No? You know, feedback from the speaker.
I see.
But try it. Let's see.
Good afternoon. It is really a pleasure for me to be here. I have, the building has improved tremendously from the old place. I feel like I have a very long relationship with StatsSA. Okay, I'm trying to get further and further away from the speaker, but it's putting me further and further away from my presentation too. So I don't know, I think I'll have to go back there. I want to express my deep appreciation to my brother Fadi. I am an intellectual who is of the activist bent, and so my life has been full of a lot of struggle. And so this struggle for me has been fruitful struggle because it has been a result of progress that we've made. And I remember when I first met Padi, it was some time ago, and the former SG said, you need to talk to this young guy. He was much younger than he is now. In fact, his hair wasn't so gray, and other parts of him weren't so grown out there. But I remember we sat and had a conversation which became a very instant bond and camaraderie. We had an idea that we could create a group of scholars from Africa and the African diaspora who would take Africa seriously. If you have ever studied demography, then you would have started with somebody named Brass talking about Africa and tropical African demography. And these individuals, Brass and these folks, they argued that new methods had to be invented to study Africa because Africans didn't have a good ability to count themselves. And since that was the situation, no serious attention should be given to census data, especially in the analysis of the demography of Africa. We begin a process of attempting to turn this around, to provide a better understanding of African census data and to use these data in understanding African demographic processes. Now, from the statistics view, you know that it's impossible to do human statistics without understanding the universe, and the universe of a population can only be gathered by a census. So we started from that point of view and argued with the entire profession of demography that there was value in the African census data and that it should be analyzed. I remember we met at some hotel not far from here.
That's fun.
We met there, and we first wanted to call our project the African Census Project, but you will recall the UN people in the room, they said, no, we already have the African Census Project, you have to choose another name. And so we added the analysis part of it because that's what we were going to focus on, and it became the African Census Analysis Project. This project did something that was fundamental to understanding how African demography is studied today. Because before our project, nobody paid serious attention to the census data, but to criticize it as an experience that had failed. When our project took full force, we not only established that African census data could be used to understand African populations, but we showed how we could make methodological advances in understanding demography by looking at African data and having collaborations among African and African diaspora scholars. Many people didn't like that. I'll be frank with you. They said, Tufuku, you need to have your collaboration broader. You need to bring in Europeans from Europe. You need to bring in other scholars from the United States. I did. I brought them in. By the time we met in Dakar in 2001, we had created an international network of scholars to support us. But we maintained that in the front of this analysis, both the technical analysis and the kind of political, intellectual analysis of this data, that African scholars had to be in front. And we maintained that throughout. Now, we suffered a lot from that. Our project suffered a lot from that. But we maintained that that was essentially what made African census data so valuable. So all of those projects which came after us, like the international poems and all of these things, they really benefited from us establishing, first of all, that African census data was a viable tool to use in understanding African human population and all of this. I give you this brief history so that you understand my relationship with Stats SA has been a very intellectual, involved, and camaraderie relationship. And it has taken place on an international stage. And so my own connection with you, some of you I don't know, some of you I have known for as long as I've known Padi, but for me to come here and talk to you, it means a very lot for me. It means it's a very warm thing in my heart to have this opportunity. So I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate the longness of the relationship, which has ventured off in so many directions that it has always been more consistent with the objective of making understanding of Africa a priority, and understanding Africa's place in the past and in the future of the world a necessity. And so I give you this long thing so that at least you enjoy how close I am to my brother. We've been in meetings all over this continent, all over this world, raising these things. We have been to Rwanda, to Senegal, to Cape Verde, to France. We have been in Bellagio. We have been many places in this long journey, and so I'm happy to be here as you hand the baton over to the young brother who I also have a long relationship with as well, and so I hope to continue my relationship with Stats SA as we move into the future in this context. So it means a lot to me to come and talk to you about what I think my life's work has been about. This moment, I took a brief moment to learn how to more effectively communicate the information from my research. When I saw that they could block us in the way that they blocked us with the African Census Analysis Project all over the world, I figured that I needed to have a better way to get beyond those things. So I made films, I learned how to do those things, and that has prepared me for presenting the work that I have been working on. And I want to give you a small peek into that work, if you will, a kind of introduction to what we are doing and where we think it will take us. We have spent a considerable amount of time learning from the world and learning from Africa and running around the African diaspora, learning things as well. So first, let me thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for taking a moment of your time to come and listen to me as I talk.
I'll have to get there is the mic here. If you could, they used to go. Feedback is so bad.
That seems like
I
it's
think you
good.
have to protect your. Yes, I think that is kind of sad.
Can you hear me there? In the back? Is it okay? All right. So, as a young boy, I grew up in a city called Oakland, California. And in that city, we had a big problem with the police. The police used to always beat on us little boys, and they used to kill the men in my community. They would shoot them with their guns. As a consequence of that, they formed an organization there when I was a little boy called the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party put together one of the most effective organizations to represent the rights of the African American community at that time. And they had a 10-point platform. And one of the elements of that platform that I will never forget They said the power that they define power as this. Power is the ability to define. And they said this is fundamental because it determines what happens after the person who has assumed the power, what they do with their power. Enumeration of human beings is one of these types of power, because the enumeration of human beings is one of the critical features in determining what it means to be a human being. And I would like you to think in these terms with me about the past and about the future. I will skip over a lot of history in order to make my main point. And if you like, during the question and answers, we can try to fill it in. But what I would like to do is give you my main thesis so that you understand the thesis has implications for understanding the past as we understand the future. I do not believe that it is effective or possible really to understand where you stand now or to understand where you can go tomorrow if you do not have an effective understanding of the past. So if you take the enumerations of human beings which have happened in the past 500 years, these counts have defined or undefined who can be a human being. They have defined or undefined who can be colonized. They have defined and undefined who can be enslaved. They have defined and undefined who can be marginalized at this point. We determine by these definitions who will be classified a refugee, who will be classified a migrant, who will be classified a citizen. As a consequence of these definitions, we determine where people have a right to live and when they're living there, what rights they have as a person. These population migrations of identity are a hidden dimension of demographic transitions. One of the most fundamental ideas in demography is this notion of demographic transition. Let me attempt to just summarize this idea for you very quickly. In the beginning, it is thought that migration is high and that mortality is high. And so that a natural increase of the population is very stable. What does this mean? This means that if you are to have 2 children survive to adulthood, it will be necessary for you to have 4 children, because high mortality and high fertility require that in order to balance themselves. If they don't balance themselves, you have natural decrease in the population. So this is combined with a notion that there is a transition in this demographic process. This transition is felt by having a very rapid fall, first in mortality, and kind of a stability in fertility. And this results in high growth, natural increase of the population, because while you're still having 4 children, 4 children are surviving. You're increasing the population by the birth of those children. The third phase is where you have still increasing, natural increase, but birth rates begin to fall and the mortality begins to fall also. So these things begin to fall, but you still have an increase in the natural growth of the population. And then there is a moment in which the births go low and the mortality goes low, and you return to a point of a very stable natural increase. And finally, there is a process where the fertility goes even lower and the mortality is kind of, very low from what it was. And at this point, you have a stable population, but the population begins to decline. That's why the human population is projected to begin to decline within the next 50 to 70 years. 50 to 70 years. We know it will already happen because we can look at the people we have. We can look at the number of babies they have and the number of deaths that they're experiencing. So that's one dimension that you need to understand what I'm talking about. The next dimension is to understand race. First of all, race, I want to suggest to you, is not genetic. Race is not a genetic marker. It is not what determines one race versus another race. People are not white and black because of genetic processes. They are white and black because we call them white and black. Actually, most of the people we call black aren't black, and most of the people we call white aren't white, at least from a color perspective. And at least it doesn't operate that way in the demographic sense, because if you take a white man and put him in the bed with a black woman and she comes up with a baby 9 months later, if it comes out gray, you're going to consider it sick, right? So the whole logic of what race means as a system of color simply doesn't work. We end up calling people who get mixed from black and white brown or some other word, but one thing we never call them is gray. And that happens all over the world with this system. What race is a socially constructed system to facilitate inequality. Race was created to justify colonialism. Race was created to justify the marginalization of non-white populations all over the world. Now, other people have picked up this tradition, but that is mainly what it has been created for. Now, I want to suggest to you that there have been a number of demographic racial transitions on planet Earth. These demographic racial transitions have transformed the world that we live in to the point where people have the identities that they have today. I want to talk to you about these various dimensions of the demographic racial transition. The first one is when people migrate in politically undefined spaces followed by the creation of race. What I mean to suggest to you here is that there is a process by which people are undefined. There is a process by which nation states are undefined, by the history of people being undefined. Here is the example that I would like to begin with for you. This is a presentation. It's not meant to give you the exact numbers of how many people moved where, but to give you a representation of what I would like to call the first demographic racial transition. It shows coming out of Europe, your white lines, the population that became the European diaspora. These are the Europeans who settled on the Cape Coast. These are the Europeans who settled in Australia. These are the Europeans who settled in Canada, who settled in the United States, who settled in all of these places and changed the map of the earth. These Europeans took with them large numbers of Africans as enslaved individuals. These enslaved individuals engaged in the first labor that created the financial basis for the creation of capitalism. You would not have had capitalism had not you had this free African labor. This is important. It's an important point for what I will say later, is to recognize that capitalism as an economic system would not have been able to be created without the free labor from Africa. Now, there's a lot of new historical research which is going back, trying to write over the white lies about the past and what created the modern society that we live in. The modern society that we live in was not created by the great individuals who control the labor of the people who did the work to produce the resources which gave us the economies and the societies that we had. From a demographic point of view, it is very important to recognize that the traditional demographic transition theory is weakened because it has not taken consideration of this colonialism or of this enslavement. As a consequence, it gives a narrative, which is the one I showed you in the beginning, which is only about fertility, and only about mortality. But by ignoring migration and ignoring the identification of other people that comes along with migration, this process, this model of demography distorts the way to understand modern society. It distorts the way to understand differences among modern societies and to understand the role and the relationship that people have played in understanding modern society. This particular figure is a representation of the demographic impact of this first demographic racial transition on Africa. You see that the height of this curve has a big bend at around 1600. And the reason it has that big bend is between 1600 and 1800, this was the height of the slave trade in African bodies by Europeans. And during that period of time, you can see from this a relative depopulation of Africa as a consequence of this trade. Now, that is in itself a demographic transition. It is taking the prime working age population of Africa for a 200-year period and putting them to work in Europe, in the Americas, for the production of the economies there. That is, those economies are being advanced at the same time that Africa is being depopulated. It didn't wipe out the African population, but it is as if someone came to South Africa today and they took 50% of the working age population and they took that population somewhere else and they put them to work. And in the process, they killed another 25% of the population who remained behind. So that Africa, in fact, was only left with a working age population of about 25% of its population for a period of approximately 300 years. And that had a devastating impact on the development of African societies, on the interrelationship of African societies, and on these societies and their relationship with Europe. It had a profound impact on the development of European economies, on the American economies, and not only the American economy in terms of the United States of America, the largest economy on planet Earth today, but also all of the other economies in the Americas. Just as an example, I'd like to take one moment to say, let us consider what the impact of these migrations out of Europe and of their bringing the large numbers of Africans with them had on other populations. This is a representation of the Native American population in the area that is now known as the United States of America. At one point, this population was totally composed of indigenous groups of people. When the Europeans came, there was a significant depopulation of that indigenous population and their displacement with populations from Europe and then Africans to come and work the land. This was devastating on this indigenous population. The demographic transition theory that we know, the way that demography looks at human populations in the past that we know, cannot even recognize this particular distinction. However, we benefit from understanding this fact. And the way we benefit is it helps us appreciate the devastation that has gone into the creation of our modern world. By not paying attention to what happened to the Native American population, you might think that these Europeans colonized a place where there was no people. You might think that the access population created by the Industrial Revolution in Britain, in France, in Germany, and that this access population which was shipped off to live in the Americas, you might think that they were going to a virgin land where there were no people, and where the land was fruitful and valuable, and there was gold in the ground and silver in the ground, and they found that, and that it just was all happy and good toast, and Europe grew strong to the one that we see now. But if you can pay attention and have a little empathy for the people who were actually affected by it, you get a sense of the devastation that was cast upon the Native American population. So what I'm suggesting is that the demographic transition, in its third phase, it had this large impact of migration on different places in the world. I've tried to show you in relief what happened to the people who suffered that impact. The African population, and with this the African population is this. So this is the devastation that the African, and I'm not looking at any particular African country, I'm just reconstituting all the African numbers by looking at the numbers that we have today of African populations and projecting it back to get an estimate of who they are. And then the indigenous population in what is now the United States of America. Another dimension of the demographic racial transitions is the immigration or racially different natural increase into politically defined space with the racialization of culture and religious differences. What do I mean by this? I mean by this process by which individuals enter a state, but the state is not undefined. Because remember, when these European explorers came to Africa, first they negotiated with Africans, but then progressively they undefined the importance of these African states, these African nations. They may have originally begun a negotiated peace, but that crumbled into a colonial reality. And that colonial reality resulted in a transformation of Africa and Africa's relationship to the rest of the world. Now, when we see some of the more recent migrations occurring in the world, some of the more recent migrations occurring, for example, to places like Europe, and this is a chart of, this is a chart, okay, hold on. This is a chart. This chart is a presentation of the growth of non-European populations in Europe today. Okay? So what it shows is that the number of people from outside of Europe who are settling in Europe is high and will continue to grow. And even if it doesn't continue to grow, the change has already happened because of the presence of these people in Europe. And these people, some of them coming from Africa, some of them coming from the Middle East, some of them coming from Asia, that the settlement of these people has had a profound impact on Europe. So profound that many Europeans are almost afraid. In fact, when they take surveys and they ask your everyday person in Europe, how do you feel about the coming of these immigrants? If they don't tell the person the demographic impact of the people, say, oh, it's no problem. They can come here, you know, as long as they follow the rules and regulations, it's okay. But if they add a little bit of demographic information to them, and that is, if they tell them that this is going to be the demographic situation, is that ultimately you're going to have 15 to 30% of the population coming from these places, or being the children of people coming from these places, they become very alarmed, and they become very frightened, and they become very upset. Because one of the things they know about their population is in the final stage of that demographic transition that I showed you, is that their population is aging. And these immigrants enter as people who can work. So they end up actually entering Europe as an asset to Europe, because they're entering as a working population who can contribute to the care and the providing of resources for this elderly population that exists in Europe. In some ways, it's a displacement from the places that they migrate from, but in another way, it is a great benefit for those European places that they arrive to. So there is this imbalance that is caused by this aging in the population. Between 1960 and 2010, the human population grew by 4 billion people. The majority of those people were Asians. Between 2010 and 2050, 2070, the human population will grow by another 4 billion people. 2 billion of those people will come as a result of longer survival in the population, right? The remaining 2 billion, almost exclusively the remaining 2 billion, will come from Africa. The human population growth that we know will exist over the next 70 years will be African. What that means primarily is that for the future, the world looks like it is becoming increasingly African. If you look at the population in the working ages, it is also increasingly African. Now, that's important to know, not just because it's African, but to know that when you have working populations which are predominantly from one particular segment, and it grows in that segment to be such a disproportionate part of the working age population, it usually means accelerated development for the society in which this working age population exists. Okay, so this is what accompanied the great advance and push of China in the world market. This is what accompanied the great transformation of and the role and place of the Indian economy in the world. And so this is just a graph to show you how that looks. The red line is China. The blue line is Pakistan, and it should be India. It is just India. It is just India. Okay, and the yellow line is Africa. And so you see that this population is growing. This population of Africans is growing, so that by 2050, it hits, by 2050, it's about 25% of the working age population in the world. During the accelerated development and growth of the Chinese economy, it had this same proportion of the population. And you could see from the Indian population, which is probably the accelerating economy, it has this as well. What I am suggesting is that the population between ages 15 and 64 is one of the demographic barometers that you can look at to know the space which has the potential to make a tremendous contribution to the human population. Now that happens for a whole host of reasons. And unless they invent robots like we see them in the movies, and we're not there yet, but maybe they will, and unless they invent those robots and invent them very quickly, we are not going to see a situation where automation replaces human contribution to the development of economies. And since if we don't see that very quickly, it means that human beings will still be the major contributors to human industrial production, to human technological advancement. And that even if it's human production at a higher level, that simply means a higher quality of human being. It means more educated individuals who are able to contribute at those higher levels of contribution. They did a survey last year in South Africa, and they asked the business community, they asked them, what are the problems that you face in terms of the population that's available to work for you? And they said the biggest problem we have is in finding individuals who have the high level of education that we need for our businesses. It is very difficult to find them. And this suggests more investment in education to increase the quality of people that exist in the society. Now, in some countries, this has to be done in contradiction to the racial hierarchy that exists in the country. In those societies where race has become such a powerful element, like the United States, like Brazil, like Colombia, like these European countries that I've just shown you, these countries have a very difficult time seeing their own populations valued. Hence, seeing the necessity of making the investment in the people as the principal investment for the future of the society. Okay? So, what I'm suggesting is at the national level then, that what we have is a situation in which we are now returning to a moment, like we've had in the past, where the African population stands to be the most important contributor to the economic future of humanity. It is not going to come from any other place where you will have that human stock. Now, this creates definitely another major problem for humanity. That is, what do we do with this segment of the population, which we already know is going to be the main people who can work for us? Now, the Chinese did it. But when the Chinese did it, they also implemented a one-child policy. And although demographically we know that the one-child policy actually ended up in a 1.5-child policy, and that later when they want to now implement the two-child policy, it's still at a 1.5-child reality, and that what that has done is it probably prevented, you know, depending on your perspective, in terms of whether it was good or bad, but I think many people are now seeing that as mixed, but that it prevented over 500 million births in China. Now, for a policy to control fertility, it was probably one of the most successful policies in the world. But what it did to China was it shifted the balance of their age structure. And shifting the balance in an age structure is not a simple thing to do for a society. But if you do it for one as large as China, if you do it for one which is as productive as China, then you've really shifted more than just the composition of the population. You've shifted the future balance of that population. That is, who is going to work in the more industrialized, more technologically advanced society that they will have of the future. If the automation is not accelerated extremely, then you don't have the people to actually feed into those places. And so they will have to diversify the actual spaces where they have the businesses, as the United States had to do. And where are they going to diversify those businesses? They will have to find places of diversification which basically can take the business, take the industrial process and people it. Okay. Hence the value of the African population, because that's where the numbers will be. And either those people will have to move to those places, or those places will have to move to those people. Given that many of the resources that people end up working on anyway, in those other places is coming out of Africa anyway, it's actually a much cheaper equation is to move those businesses to some space in Africa. But I know nobody is really talking about those things today, because Europe is more obsessed with how it blocks individuals who are migrating from Africa, migrating from Asia into those countries. And this blocking of the people is more a consequence of their racial consciousness that they created by their colonialism around the world. And in fact, some of the biggest motivators of people moving to these countries now is a consequence of their involvement with the West, with the United States, and with Europe in, in various wars around the world. I mean, Badi and I counted about 7 wars on the African continent over dinner last night. Maybe you can come up with more. But we do know that there is an acceleration of war on the African continent. There is an acceleration of war in the Middle East. There is an acceleration of war. These wars are being fought, and they are dismantling the societies in which they are being fought. And as a consequence of that, many people are moving out of those countries because of the destabilization of the country. And they're finding themselves at the steps of those who created the guns that they're using to kill the people, or are shooting the drones from their unmanned planes in the sky. There's a certain inequality in it, and this inequality is the reason that we have such a large number of individuals who are migrating across borders today. The United Nations estimates that there is 65.4 million refugees today, and this includes both internally displaced and externally displaced populations. Most of those individuals, of course, are residing in neighboring countries. So if you are a neighbor of Sudan, if you are a neighbor of Nigeria, if you are a neighbor of Syria, you are a neighbor of Afghanistan, this is where you will find the majority of these refugee populations. And these populations are knocking on these societies' doors. Now, when they go to the door of the place which created the nature of the problem of which they are escaping, they are blocked. And they are told that only a certain number can come in. And in fact, when they try to get there, they have to apply for a status to be a refugee, to be taken care of. And it is there where we see a bigger screen. When Germany accepted 1 million refugees, primarily from Syria and South Sudan, a couple of years ago, the world stood up and said, wow, look at this. But at the same time, in the same year, equal numbers of refugees were found in South Africa, in Pakistan, and in other countries very close to some of these human catastrophes which had happened. Okay? So this is another demographic racial transition. But sometimes these demographic racial transitions don't occur because of immigration. They can occur because of natural increase. This is the South African population between 1911 and the estimates for 2017. And what you see here is a marked increase in the number of Africans, classified Africans in the population. If you take this red line, is a measure between 0 and 1. It's 1 when the population is evenly diversified, and it is 0 when there is just one group in the population. So if you remember back, the Native American figure I showed you, when it was all just that population, it would have been 0. When all the other groups, the African Americans, the Europeans, the Asians came in, it would have moved somewhere in between 0 and 1. And so what you see since 1985 is an increase in the African population and a slow decline of the index of diversity in the population. Now, we know diversity can be measured in many ways. There's one way to measure the diversity in the African population itself. There's another way to measure the diversity in the white population itself. But if we take these 4 as population groups, which have some measurement similarity over time, we could enumerate them in ways which make some kind of sense for the logic of what might be happening in South Africa at this time. Let me move on. So what I've given to you are 3 types of demographic racial transitions. Well, I think I've only given you 2. I'll talk a little bit about the second one. The first one I gave you was migration into politically redefined spaces, followed by the use of race to dehumanize the marginalized groups. And this was the process of enslavement, the process of colonization that occurred in places like North America, but we could have as easily talked about the Cape Coast, we could have easily talked about Australia, we could have easily talked about these other places as well. The second one is migration into politically defined spaces, followed by the racialization of cultural and religious differences. And here we're talking about the European Union and you know, and what is currently happening in the European Union, but also what is currently happening in South Africa, which is just a natural result of the differentials in fertility. Although they may be slight, the demographic implications of them are quite profound. And what you see, that's why when you look at this particular figure, what you see in South Africa is not something that's just now happening, because it's really the force of demography, the force of population that you see. So really what you see now is a result of differentials in fertility rates 5 or 10 years ago. And what you see 10 years ago is a difference of fertility rates 10 years before. And so even if you really understand what's happening now, it's a consequence of a buildup over 30 years. And so it won't change very easily. It will continue on. Actually, what's happening for the next 10 years, you can find it in these 10 years by the people who are even able or available to make the changes. It's the force of demography, in a word. And the other is changes in the system of racial classification, which is what I started with. Because in the beginning, we could say in a non-religious way that everybody was African. And it is out of Africa that Africans migrated and began to transform into all of these other people. So that really the colonization of Africa was with people who once originally migrated out of Africa, just returning to Africa and returning with a kind of bitterness. And that bitterness led to a kind of colonization. That colonization led to pushing Africa into a certain relationship with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world in a certain relationship with Africa. Here in South Africa, you have a good way of understanding that, because you're in a good position to see how this process and system has worked. While colonialism highlighted much of the 20th century for most of Africa, the apartheid system was its reflection in South Africa. And apartheid was based on being able to racially classify people into spaces in which they were marginalized, and to classify other people into positions in which their status in society was elevated. And by using racial classification in these ways, it had a profound impact on the population. And these profound impacts continue to be felt today. Let me add my final words, and I'll just give 3 final words, if you will. One is that the demographic racial transitions are happening, and they could result in more international and domestic equality or more apartheid. It is not a good strategy, in my view, to think that any one nation operates today in isolation of other nations. It just doesn't work like that. It has stopped working like that a long time ago. The United States, its economy, is totally based on its relationship with the rest of the world. If it doesn't understand or take care with those relationships, its economy simply collapses. The United States' relationship with other countries in the world is the basis on which its wealth is founded. The U.S. has an economy which people estimate to be about $80 trillion. Those closest to the U.S. are China and Japan, and their closeness is still under $30 trillion. The U.S. vast lead as an economy in the world is totally a result of its relationship with other spaces in the world. The future depends on changing these international relationships to be more equitable for the world. If we don't do that, then what we will see is simply an exaggeration of what we have now. The demands for change and for modifications in our behavior as a consequence of climate, as a consequence of the limited resources that exist on planet Earth, require a redistribution of resources if it's going to take place. In other words, it is a call for certain people to accept their place in the world and to quit thinking of progress and to simply find comfort in where they are, not to dream of the world that could be with a better use of the resources which exist on the earth. In order to have that kind of equality, it would require a reimagining of our politics. It would require a reimagining of how people around the world deal with each other. And it would require that we humbly recognize that we are dependent upon each other. The current government in the United States is not very sympathetic to these kinds of ideas. They would have us move more towards apartheid. And this is a problem I recognize. It's a problem which has happened from time to time. It is a limit which we as human beings really can't afford, although it's an extravagance that is definitely threatening what we have. But we need to get beyond these fears. This fear of demographic racial suicide, which is behind all of the anti-immigration rhetoric that we hear, is also related to the renegotiating the relationships of power as they exist in the world. If you do not renegotiate those relationships of power, you can definitely be guaranteed no one is going to renegotiate the distribution of wealth on the planet Earth. That is, you may get a few more billionaires, you may get a few more millionaires, but you will not get a redistribution of the human wealth so that it finds its hands more in, or it finds its way more in the hands of those who are in the most disadvantaged situation. And this requires a rethinking of what it means to be a human, a rethinking of our past and what has accounted for the wealth that exists, a rethinking of the ways that we should go forward. Today we have war. We have war all over the planet. And we have a fear of war. This fear of war, I'm old enough to remember when the fear of war was all based on drugs. And so everybody talked about the war on drugs. And they sent the planes to bomb the places that were involved in the war on drugs. They sent their drones to drop bombs out of the fear of these places with the war on drugs. What accompanied this rise of the war on drugs was the use of certain nations' political force, their military forces, as the police on planet Earth. That is, they would police the world and they would help solve the problem. When the problem was drugs, they would help in the fight against drugs. Now the problem is terror. And terror is seen to be everywhere, under every stone. And these police of the world are going to solve the problems wherever they find terror. If they find it in Syria, they fight in Syria. If they find it in Iraq, they fight in Iraq. If they find it in Libya, they fight in Libya. If they find it in Nigeria, they fight in Nigeria. In Somalia, they fight in Somalia. I'd like to suggest to you that there's a certain inequity in the very idea that this is how you fight terror. There's a very inequity in the notion that someone can police a space in which people don't have a say in their being policed. It is a fundamental understanding. Okay, I come from a country called the United States of America. This country had a civil war, or it had a revolutionary war, mind you, and the Revolutionary War was on the basis of this. taxation without representation. Now we're talking about something different here, which is policing. But to police people and to tell them what kind of government they can have, to tell them who can rule their society, without giving those people a say in your decision to police them, is tyranny. And it is not a just use of the world's resources, of human resources, to make it so that certain people... that was my last slide. That's my last slide anyway. It's tyranny to have a police force, no matter how big, how sophisticated, or how many drones they have, or how many billions of dollars of sophistication it costs, or how many organizations that exist to support that entity as the police force of humanity, determining which war we will fight. And I know it was drugs in the past, and I know that it's terror now, and it's not because I don't have a fear of drugs, they made me fearful of drugs, or that I don't have a fear of terror, because they've made me very frightened about the terror. But I feel that if someone is going to police the world, then they must allow the world to have a say in that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, TZ. I know that you have many questions, but as I said, we have 3 discussants, each one of them about 5 minutes, and of course, the new statistician general here will do the final one, and then we will open up for a few questions if there are, and then close. Rholihlahla, you have 5 minutes, and you can have this. Rholihlahla is the reigning president of the Young African Statisticians, and the challenge, Rholihlahla, is to come here. You see, yes, you must use this one. But when you use it, you will stand here, and then you can take your. And the Young African Statisticians are across the continent. And as we are talking with TZ, he said, knowledge is troublesome. It's a troublesome thing. And I suppose you guys want to be knowledgeable and you want to be troublesome. Exactly. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Our Police Statistician General, Economic Statistician General, Chief Presenga Manuleke, and our